Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the Ruth Bader Ginsburg question and answer event. I want to give a special thanks to the Department of Political Science, the College of Liberal Arts, our panelists, our moderator, and specifically Jen Hitt, who organized this wonderful event. We're so happy that you are here this evening. To start, I would like to introduce those who are involved in this event this evening. First, our moderator this evening is President Joyce McConnell, 15th President of Colorado State University. Our panelists include Dr. Matthew Hitt, Associate Professor of Political Science at CSU, and Dr. Courtenay Daum, Professor of Political Science at CSU. Toward the end of the event, you will hear from Sam Houghteling, Director of the Straayer Center for Public Service Leadership at CSU. Our event this evening will last until 8 o'clock, and we will be utilizing questions submitted by all of you prior to the event. With that, I have the sincere privilege and honor of introducing our moderator this evening, the 15th President of Colorado State University, President Joyce McConnell.
Of course, I have to unmute myself. Thank you so much, Cole. It's really an honor to be here, and I'm delighted to be here with Professor Hitt and Professor Daum and with you. And it's just an amazing, wonderful thing. When I got the invitation to moderate, I was thrilled because I really needed to have an opportunity to talk about Justice Ginsburg. And my family was tired of listening to me, so I needed to share it with more people. I wanted to tell my own personal story about Justice Ginsburg because I think it will shed some light on her and the scope of her impact on people like me. So Justice Ginsburg actually graduated in the Columbia Law School class in 1959, and she became a law professor in 1963. I believe she became a tenured faculty member at Columbia in 72. So fast forward 10 years, she's obviously one of the founding female law professors in the United States. There were a handful, really, that was it. And I became a law fellow and then a law professor in 1984. So this is 14 years, or 12, I guess 12 years after she had become a law professor. And she had already been appointed to the bench. She was already a Court of Appeals judge in Washington, D.C. when I became a law professor. And I went to my first conference. It was the Association of American Law Schools conference. And we went into a ballroom, which was the meeting space for the section on women in legal education. And this was a section that Justice Ginsburg had started to try to bring female law professors together. So this was in 1984, and in 1984, there were a little bit more than a handful, but if you think about those 8 top or 10 top tables in a hotel ballroom, we only filled 2. And Justice Ginsburg spoke about her experience as a law professor and then gave us a sense of hope and a sense of our significance in the law school classroom. And it was really quite phenomenal. Fast forward many, many years later, I became the president of the section of women in legal education, and we filled the ballroom. There were hundreds of female law professors, and we had the amazing opportunity to honor Justice Ginsburg as a founder. It was really an amazing day, but for me, it was sort of the whole journey of what had happened with women in legal education. And she really was so important to our ability to organize and to learn from one another. Then when I became the dean of the College of Law at West Virginia University, I was able to bring Justice Ginsburg to speak to our students. And she's really was an extraordinary human being because not only was she brilliant and not only did she litigate and decide more than 300 cases dealing with equality, She was a great human being, and she connected with people in a way that really mattered. And so I wanted to share that story with everyone because she was more than just brilliant to me. She was more than the most amazing. I think her significance in both activism and jurisprudence is probably only matched by Thurgood Marshall. It's a very rare combination to have a justice who has that background of legal activism and of the time spent year after year after year moving an equality agenda forward. And so it's such an honor for me to be here this evening. I can't thank you all enough for including me. And I want to comment just on how important this is to our campus. So thank you so very much for all your work in putting this together. And thank you to all the attendees for taking your time. I know everyone's tired of being on screen. So to be on screen one more hour, it really is taking a lot of resilience, and I thank you all very much. I know that guests have submitted questions, and I also know that these questions really fell into one of 4 categories. And so rather than going through each question, and obviously we would run out of time, we've spent the time to group them together. So your panelists are not going to answer your questions individually, but rather we've grouped them together. And I'm going to be asking those overarching questions. And I certainly hope that you hear your question being answered. And hopefully we'll have another opportunity to speak if there's just a riotous demand for more attention spent on Justice Ginsburg, which I would be pleased about. So I'm going to go ahead and start with our questions. And I think the first one, Professor Daum, is really for you, and that is, what were Justice Ginsburg's biggest decisions, and what is her legacy?
Thanks, Joyce, and thanks everybody for coming tonight, and to Jennifer, Hitt, and Cole for organizing. It's a pleasure to be here, and like Joyce, I want to start by acknowledging that I can only be here today because of people like Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Joyce before me, who paved the way for women in the field of feminist legal theory. So I really appreciate this opportunity to honor somebody who was so significant in getting me to where I am today. When I thought about this question, I think there's 2 ways to answer it, and I'm going to try and briefly attend to each one. But I think, in order to be honest about Justice Ginsburg's most significant decisions on the court, you have to first talk about her role as a litigator and the strategies that she deployed to bring cases before the U.S. Supreme Court in order to advance equal rights for men and women. And certainly a major a central tenet of Ginsburg's strategy was to always talk about promoting equality between men and women and among the sexes, as opposed to simply trying to advance the equal rights of women. And that was a strategy that she deployed in the cases that she argued before the US Supreme Court. And I think, perhaps the pinnacle of her Supreme Court career as a litigator was probably the Frontier v. Richardson case, where she came the closest to persuading the US Supreme Court that any policy or law that categorized on the basis of sex should be treated the same as any policy or law that categorized on the basis of race. And while she actually did not persuade a majority of the justices that that should be the case, she was able to persuade 4, and that's the closest the justices have ever come to that. But that desire to see that discrimination on the basis of sex would be treated by the courts similarly to the way that discrimination on the basis of race is treated, then informed her position as a U.S. Supreme Court justice. And I think, probably the pinnacle case of her career is the U.S. v. Virginia case, which most of us refer to as the VMI case, the Virginia Military Institute case, where the Supreme Court was asked to evaluate the Virginia Military Institute's admissions policy, which refused to consider applications from women. And it's important to note that the Virginia Military Institute is a public school, which is important for legal reasons, but we don't have to get into that today. But essentially, the question for the US Supreme Court was, could a public institution of higher education discriminate against and exclude women from consideration for admission? And I don't think it's a surprise that Ginsburg wrote the majority opinion and ruled that the Virginia Military Institute could not exclude women. But I think substantively, that opinion did two important things that are really a reflection of who Ginsburg was as a US Supreme Court justice. And the first thing that I would say is she does a little sleight of hand in that opinion, where she doesn't explicitly say, we're going to use the same standard that we utilize to evaluate laws and policies that discriminate on the basis of race. But she kind of cooks up a new standard and modifies what we call intermediate scrutiny just enough to give it the sort of effect of strict scrutiny. And when I was took gender in the law at Georgetown Law School, my professor was Wendy Webster Williams, who's much like Ginsburg.
I know Wendy.
Oh, I love her. She's
really well.
She's great. So she wouldn't remember me. I was like just one person in her class. But when we talked about the US v. Virginia case, people were really pushing back about, like, is that what Ginsburg was really trying to do? And Professor Williams wrote Ruth Bader Ginsburg's biography. They're very close friends. And she sort of said, like, yeah, I'm pretty sure that's what she was trying to do, right? Like that she had the skinny on it. But I think that was really significant because that was, I think, in many ways for Ginsburg, finishing the work that she had started decades prior as a litigator, that she had got to the US Supreme Court, and even though she couldn't get it exactly the way she wanted, in effect, she was able to, in that case, it sort of finish her agenda. The sad part of the story is that the Supreme Court only ever uses that standard one more time. Now they've moved away from it. But I do think that's really significant. I think the other thing, though, that makes that case so significant is that Ginsburg is really clear in that opinion about the fact that women cannot be denied admission to VMI. Because even though most women may have no interest in going to the Virginia Military Institute, just one may want to, right? Or two may want to, or 10 may want to. But this idea that we can't make policies based on assumptions about sex stereotypes and sex roles and what the majority of women want. And so I think that case was so significant because she really lays out that position. And she says, most women don't want this, but that can't be the way that we justify legislation, that we cannot write and craft laws that leave the few exemplary women or outlier women out. And similarly, that you can't do the same thing for men. And I don't know how much time I have, but I would just sort of say the Session v. Morales case, which she decided and wrote the majority opinion for in 2017, does a similar thing with respect to sex roles for men. And that's a really complicated case that I don't want to get into all the details, but essentially what was at issue in this case was a question of if a child is born to unwed parents, US law provided citizenship if the unwed mother was a US citizen, but not if the unwed father was a US citizen. And it's actually more complicated than that. I'm oversimplifying. But in the Session v. Morales case, Ginsburg then says, you cannot assign citizenship access in that way based on assumptions about the fact that if a couple is not married and they have a child, that the mother will be the primary caregiver, that it may be the norm that the mother will be the primary caregiver, but there are also instances in which fathers will be the primary caregiver or the legal guardian. And so she really pushed in the Session v. Morales case in the same way against this idea that we can't base policies on assumptions about sex and gender roles. And I think for me, that's really her legacy on the court, because she was so uniquely situated to make those arguments and advance them successfully. And I think for me as a as a feminist legal scholar, I look at those cases really as the culmination of a lifetime of work. And certainly she was in the majority in really important cases, wrote really significant decisions, but those two cases are just so exemplary of what she was really about as a litigator prior to getting on the court. And so those are the two that I really hold up as exemplars of her jurisprudence. And I would just say, I think we're seeing her legacy unfold in real time right now. I was just reading the newspaper with my daughter before I came up here today, and we were looking at the pictures in the New York Times of the little girl in her Ruth Bader Ginsburg costume and teenage girls with their Ruth Bader Ginsburg knee socks on and all the, different attire. And I think, she has inspired. It's pretty amazing, right? That late in her career and life, she was able to inspire a whole new generation of young boys and girls who hold her values really dear and who will be inspired by her going forward. And I think at the end of the day, what greater legacy to have than that?
Thank you so much. That was such a great overview. And it just warms my heart to hear you move through that and really be able to illustrate the gift that she gave us. So I really appreciate that.
Thanks, Joyce.
Professor Hitt, I'm going to turn to you now. And I know this is something on everyone's minds. What's the process of filling a seat? And how has it changed over time? How should we understand this now?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Joyce. So first I do want to say too, so my research area is in judicial politics, congressional politics, that sort of thing. So this answer is going to get fairly political sounding, but I do want to just pause for a moment to just echo, we are also in the process of mourning a true giant of American law. And I did want to, you can't see it, but I do have my Ruth Bader Ginsburg dissent collar tie bar. I can't pull off the real thing. I tried. It didn't look quite right. But just in memory of someone who has been very inspirational to children, women and men across America, and Saturday Night Live even, which is a first for the Supreme Court, I'm almost certain. But to this question on the process of filling the seat, where we're at right now, and what's probably going to happen in the next, 6-8 weeks. So the process for filling a Supreme Court vacancy is constitutionally pretty straightforward, right? So the president is constitutionally empowered to name a nominee of their choosing. President Trump has, indicated that his short list is down to 5 folks. He intends to make a nomination probably tomorrow or Saturday. We'll see who that might be. Then that nomination is sent over to the Senate's Judiciary Committee, and the Judiciary Committee will hold hearings. These will be public and televised. I'm sure many folks watching remember the incredibly contentious hearings for Brett Kavanaugh not that long ago. It feels like a million years ago because of everything that's happening, but not that long ago we were doing this. It was incredibly contentious. I think you can expect a similar temperature in the room this time around, almost no matter who the nominee is. And the reason for that, of course, the reason I think many of you might have signed up for this, the timing of this nomination, the timing of this vacancy is where we get into some really murky and interesting territory in terms of the norms and the precedents of how we do things around this incredibly important moment. So someone asked, can we talk about the proximity to the presidential election, right? So short answer is, historically, we have never filled a Supreme Court seat this close to a presidential election. The only Supreme Court vacancy that was closer to an election than this one was when Chief Justice Taney passed away right before the election of 1864. So we have to really dig back into history to find something analogous. And at that time, we were a little busy. There was a civil war on. But nevertheless, Abraham Lincoln waited until after he'd won re-election for that seat. So if you don't think the seat should be filled, you say, aha, the president clearly supports forbearance here. On the other hand, for additional context, Antonin Scalia's seat opened with his passing 269 days before the election of 2016. The shoe was on the other foot at that time. You had a Democrat in the presidency. And so many elite Democrats, in Washington were saying, yeah, we've got to fill this seat, even though it's an election year and we don't always fill seats this close to elections. Now the roles are reversed. Republicans who in 2016 were saying, no, we've got to let the American people weigh in, decide who will be their next Supreme Court justice in the fall election, now are saying, well, constitutionally, we have the right to do this. We're going to do this. The arguments have just pretty much flip-flopped. Another point I wanted to make about this, someone asked, I thought was a really clever question about whether the Democrats have some sort of upper hand in controlling the narrative, right, on how the politics and the public presentation that's going to be made in the media and the confirmation hearings, how that's going to play out. And I hate to say it, it seems like not really. If you remember, a million years ago in 2016, there was a lot of very disciplined messaging from people like Mitch McConnell and other Republican senators about the Biden rule. Because in 1992, Joe Biden had said in a speech talking about hypotheticals, oh, well, we would never fill a Supreme Court seat in a presidential election. We just wouldn't do that. There wasn't a vacancy at the time. He was just saying, well, this is sort of where I'm at with in 1992. But it was incredibly disciplined messaging. There's a lot of interviews where Republicans in 2016 went on and on about the Biden rule says we can't fill Antonin Scalia's seat. This time around, you're not hearing, say, Chuck Schumer, Joe Biden, Nancy Pelosi, any sort of elite Democrats going on about the McConnell rule for not filling a seat in a presidential. You're not hearing that sort of message discipline. So if elite Democrats had wanted to control the narrative and take advantage of that, that window of opportunity may have passed, that sort of thing. And what we're seeing right now, if you follow the polls, if you're looking for, well, what is this going to do to the presidential election, to Senate elections that are coming up, that sort of thing. So far in the early going, we're not seeing the needle moving a whole lot. The only little difference we're seeing is that if you ask prospective voters what issues are the most important to you in this fall's election, for the first time ever, as far as I can recall, more Democratic voters are saying the Supreme Court is one of their most important issues compared to Republicans. And that's a big reversal of where we've been at for really since the 1970s, where conservative voters have tended to think the Supreme Court is vital and crucial to their vote choice. Democrats have sometimes focused on other things. So you are seeing more Democrats fired up about this. There was another great question that brought up this notion of hypocrisy, right? Doesn't everyone look like a hypocrite right now in Washington? 4 years ago, when the shoe was on the other foot, everyone in Washington was saying the opposite of what they're saying right now. And again, this is maybe the political scientist in me. Hypocrisy is kind of a funny thing in politics. It only really seems to bother people when the other guys are doing it, the other team is doing it, right? Because now you're certainly seeing rationalizations. Lindsey Graham has said, well, after the way they treated Brett Kavanaugh, that rules out the window. And then Mitch McConnell is now saying, well, it's because now the Senate and the presidency are controlled by the same party. So that makes it okay to fill the seat that's close to an election. So if it's you can always find a rationalization out of hypocrisy that it might not convince everyone, but it might convince your supporters, your voters, your constituency base. Let's see. Oh, I see something in the chat here. Let's see if I can get to that before. Why aren't we hearing these elite Democrats trying to control messaging? So I do think there is a systematic difference between Republican and Democratic political elites in terms of how media messaging is conducted. I think there has historically been more organization in the Republican Party about staying on message. These are the talking points of the day. There's a little more messaging. This one that's broken down a little bit now as you're seeing some splinter factions in Congress that have started to do their own thing. Democrats don't, generally speaking, have an analogous organization. There aren't, if Chuck Schumer calls up, say, Ed Markey, the senator from Massachusetts who wants to pack the court, and said, listen, Ed, that's not our talking point for today. Ed's going to say, so what? I'm going to say what I want to say. This is what I believe. And there's not that same cohesiveness of message. Why that is, that would just be speculation. I do think there's a marked difference between how you have seen the two different contentious vacancies play out 4 years apart here. Yeah, the last point on this, and this is sort of the real politic of it. Someone asked sort of a question. It's been reported that Ruth Bader Ginsburg dictated to her granddaughter that her dying wish was that the next president would, that the winner of the 2020 presidential election would fill her seat. And said, well, does that matter? It's sentimentally, yeah, especially if you support the kinds of political and social legal outcomes that Ruth Bader Ginsburg advanced. But in terms of being constraining or meaningful to the folks who are in control of Congress right now, the short answer is no. And to be fair, in 2016, Ruth Bader Ginsburg did say, I think President Obama should fill Antonin Scalia's seat in a similar situation. So again, there's, depending on where you're coming at this nomination from, you can see a lot of people whose positions have evolved.
Thank you very much for that. That was really, really helpful. I know. Dr. Daum, I'm gonna toss this one to you. And this is something that I know is on a lot of people's minds. Is there anything that Democrats can do to stop the appointment and confirmation process? And if not, what are the consequences for the court and for us as a society?
Yeah, thank you, Joyce. I think the honest answer is no, that there's not much that the Democrats in Congress and specifically in the Senate can do right now. We have a process that is set up. And I know that Professor Hitt will talk about this a little bit later about, court packing and things like that. So I'm going to leave that for him. But, we have a process that is set up that the president nominates and the Senate confirms, and it requires a majority, simple majority. And we have a Republican president and we have a Republican Senate. And so the opportunities to derail this that are available to Senate Democrats are really few and far between. I mean, they could try and obstruct and just slow things down indefinitely, but they're the minority party. And Majority Leader McConnell, this is a priority for his. It has always been a priority for him. This has always been, really the single most significant part of his agenda as Majority Leader. And so Senator McConnell can do everything that he can to get this done. There's been some discussion about the House of Representatives doing some things to try and make it more difficult for the Senate to take up a confirmation hearing. So for example, we've heard the House could impeach the president again, or they could impeach Attorney General Barr, with the idea being that the Senate would then have to take up the impeachment hearing, and that would delay their ability to have a confirmation hearing for the Supreme Court seat. But at the end of the day, the reality is, they don't have to have hearings. I mean, that's in the Constitution does not say, and you must have hearings for this number of days. I mean, in the immediate hour after the news broke that Justice Ginsburg had died, my phone lit up with everyone asking, well, what is the prescribed amount of time, for the hearings to unfold? And I was like, no time. I mean, it could happen tomorrow. I mean, that's the Constitution does not specify any sort of time requirement. And so I think the opportunities really to obstruct this are few and far between. And the only thing that could happen would be that Senate Republicans would make the decision to delay this, in the event that Joe Biden won the presidential election and they wanted to wait until, to allow the party, the Democratic Party to have the opportunity to make this nomination. So then I think that brings us to the question, we should assume that President Trump's nominee will be confirmed. And what does that mean for the court? And I think there's a lot of speculation about different issue areas. And I think, we can certainly talk about that. I think some issue areas are certainly more vulnerable than others. I certainly think Roe v. Wade is vulnerable because, the most recent decision declaring unconstitutional a restrictive abortion law from the state of Louisiana required Chief Justice Roberts to vote with the liberal justices, who included Justice Ginsburg, to declare that law to be unconstitutional. And now Justice Ginsburg presumably will be replaced by somebody who does not support Roe v. Wade. I say presumably because you just never know. And I think that's one thing everybody needs to remember is presidents nominate individuals to be Supreme Court justices all the time who they expect to act a certain way. and they do not. And that list is long. It was Dwight Eisenhower, right? When he left the presidency, they said, what was your biggest mistake as president? He said, there's two, and they both sit on the US Supreme Court. And so this idea that, this person will be exactly what the Republicans forecast, I think is not necessarily accurate. But I certainly do think, Roe v. Wade is one of the most vulnerable decisions. That's been something that Republican presidents and Republicans in Senate and the Federalist Society, right, an organization of conservative judges, has been, and lawyers, has been very proactive about targeting Roe v. Wade. But I also think the thing that people need to remember is if the US Supreme Court overturns Roe v. Wade, that does not mean that abortion automatically becomes illegal in all 50 states, right? Overturning Roe v. Wade then returns to the states the authority to make decisions about the extent to whether or not abortion will or will not be legal in those states. There's been some speculation about LGBTQ rights. And, I think this last term, in a pretty shocking decision, we had Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Gorsuch both decide that Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act applies to LGBTQ individuals. And so that suggests to me that coalition on the court does not map directly onto the ideology of the president who nominated you. But I think the other question that President McConnell asked is what does it mean for us? And I think I was telling my common law students this week that I would give anything in the world to be at Chief Justice Roberts' dinner table this week, because he is very strongly committed as a judge to the legitimacy of the US Supreme Court and its institutional integrity and how it's perceived by the American public. And I'm sure he is very concerned about the way that this process is being perceived as being really political. And I do think, his concern is justified, that if the American public believes that the Supreme Court nomination and confirmation process has become just another political prize, which we could argue in many ways it has been, but maybe we've not been fully accepting of that. But if that's what the American public starts to feel, that's something that the justices themselves are going to be concerned about, right? The integrity of the court, because we have to remember the justices have no ability to enforce their decisions on us. They rely on us, the people, accepting those decisions. And so institutional legitimacy is something that's really important to the justices. And I'm sure that's something that they're concerned about right now. I think the other thing, if I just have another minute, the other thing that I would say is, I think the other option that is available to Democrats is that they are not able to block the confirmation of a Trump nominee, but that they threaten to do some pretty wild things should they get the majority in the Senate in November, and should Joe Biden win the presidency. And we've already seen some of those things being floated. And some of those examples include, threatening to grant the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico statehood, which would then mean that would come with 2 senators and a member of the U.S. House of Representatives. And for those of you who don't know, the District of Columbia is an incredibly progressive city. And so we could pretty much guarantee that 2 senators from Washington, D.C., should it be a state, would be Democrats. They also have talked about the possibility of fixing the problems that the US Supreme Court found with the Voting Rights Act in a Supreme Court decision a few years ago. And I would argue that they should fix that anyway, because it's their legislative obligation to fix legislation that is defective. But it's an incredibly controversial issue because, long story short, if they attended to this aspect of the Voting Rights Act, it would require federal government oversight to be reinstated in a number of jurisdictions throughout the United States, which would then increase voting opportunities for marginalized and disenfranchised groups, which may not be something that Republicans all necessarily want. So I think, Democrats can make some threats. I don't think that's going to discourage McConnell from moving forward with the confirmation process. But, come January, if Republicans have lost the majority in the Senate and have lost the White House, and Democrats have retained control of the House, the ability to pass legislation that may be very undesirable to Republicans will be way easier. And I think the last thing I would say, and then I'll turn it, then I will surrender the floor, is that, the other thing the Democrats have said is that they could get rid of the filibuster. And so we're assuming, right, that Democrats are, if they win control of the Senate, are not going to have 60 seats in the Senate. And so getting rid of the filibuster just requires a simple majority vote. So if they had 51 Democrats in the Senate, they could get rid of the filibuster, which would then make it way easier for them to put forward legislation that would create a new formula for the Voting Rights Act, to make the Voting Rights Act more really viable again, to extend statehood to U.S. territories and the District of Columbia, and to do a number of other things. So I think, you know, those are after the fact options, but I think there's threats that I'm sure Chuck Schumer is you know, wielding right now in discussions with Senate Republicans.
That's so interesting. Thank you so much for that insight. It's really wonderful. Since I'm a DC native originally, it's wonderful to hear DC spoken about as possibly getting statehood.
I agree.
Thank you for bringing that into the conversation. And it would be another joy. Eleanor Holmes Norton served as the representative, right, for forever, another Georgetown law professor. So good connection there. So another question that is starting to get tossed around, and I think people really need a good foundation to understand what it even means historically, is what happens if the Democrats try to pack the court later? Can they even do that? And if they can do it, how do they do it?
Yeah, so this is the question of the day in a lot of circles, right? So what does it mean to pack the court? Well, one of the things that I think, as we go about our day-to-day lives, unless you're a political scientist, is you just sort of think, well, there's 9 Supreme Court justices. Surely that's in the Constitution. There shall be 9, and that's just what we're left with. No, not remotely. The size of the Supreme Court is determined by Congress, right? So by a simple act of Congress that would presumably be signed by whoever's president, or a 2/3 majority in both houses of Congress, which is harder to come by these days, you could add seats to the Supreme Court, right? You know, so if, in a hypothetical world where Democrats control both houses of Congress and the presidency come 2021, it is certainly the case that they could pass a statute adding 2, 3, 4, whatever, many seats to the U.S. Supreme Court, which would immediately be filled by a President Biden in this scenario. Right now, a lot of people want to shoot for, you know, the records of George Washington and Franklin Delano Roosevelt for appointing lots of Supreme Court justices. Right? It is tempting, I think, for folks to look at this and say, well, you know, it's sort of remarkable if you think about it. The presidency has gone back and forth between Republican and Democratic control relatively evenly for the last 40, 50 years. Yet 14 of our last 18 Supreme Court appointments were made by Republican presidents, 2 of whom actually lost the popular vote. That's sort of by the weird idiosyncratic nature of our Supreme Court with its life terms. Vacancies arise more or less randomly. Some justices seem to retire strategically when they know that a like-minded president will be filling their seat, but more often than not, some presidents get lucky. President Trump, with 3 opportunities to make appointments in his first 4 years, is extraordinarily lucky. Someone like Jimmy Carter served for 4 years as president. He got the goose egg, none. So because of that idiosyncrasy, the makeup of the court in terms of who's making the appointments doesn't necessarily map onto the political outcomes of the electoral process in a really clean way. And some people are troubled by that, some people aren't. So to fix this imbalance in the minds of some commentators right now, you would pass that act of Congress, you would add a number of seats to the Supreme Court to presumably have a majority that were then appointed by a Democrat, right? And this has been floated in American history before. The most famous incident by far, which I'm sure many folks will be familiar with, in the 1930s, we were in the middle of the Great Depression, things were really rough. President Roosevelt, with the support of Congress, of course, passed really progressive, really far-reaching New Deal programs to try and rescue the economy. But the U.S. Supreme Court, which had a bunch of appointees left over from previous presidential administrations, kept standing in his way, kept ruling that New Deal programs were in fact violated the Constitution in various ways. President Roosevelt made some comment about how it's hard for the cart of government to be pulled if one horse doesn't pull, implying that the Supreme Court should just get in line with his particular policy preferences and do whatever he says. And so to fix this problem, FDR basically came up with a plan to add a bunch of justices to the court. He went on a barnstorming tour of the United States, trying to drum up support for this. There's not a ton of good public opinion data from the 1930s, but what we do have shows that this idea wasn't all that popular. And in the end, what happened, one of these more economically conservative justices all of a sudden came to the realization that a lot of New Deal programs were constitutional. And then the Supreme Court started pulling the cart, more or less, for Roosevelt, and the court packing plan just sort of withered and died. So people make the point, well, even a president as popular as Roosevelt was, and he won in landslides, was unable to pack the court. It cost him politically. He was unsuccessful in doing it. Even members of his own party in Congress were like, whoa, like this is a really big step. And so to see that sort of effort founder at that time, I think might give some people pause that this is a step maybe too far, maybe politically risky to do so. On the other hand, it's important to note too that all the justices that Roosevelt was trying to effectively replace or neutralize got in their seats sort of through an ordinary process that was not controversial. Whereas in this time around, certainly the seat now occupied by Neil Gorsuch is highly controversial because of the blockade of Merrick Garland, and certainly whoever fills this seat, this will also be a very controversial appointment. So that's what's picking up some of the steam for the arguments to do this. So could Congress add seats to the Supreme Court with a basic act of Congress? Yes, they could. They would almost certainly have to get rid of the legislative filibuster in the Senate to do it, because again, as Professor Daum said, there's probably not going to be 60 Democratic votes in the Senate under any realistic scenario for this fall's elections. Now, the other question is, though, should they do it, right? And that's a values question, depending on where you're at politically, how you read this thing. There's a lot of reasonable answers to that question. That said, one concept that is really important in democratic governance that we really don't talk about very much is forbearance. The Constitution permits our leaders to do lots of stuff that they don't do, and it's understood there are norms that it's really not a great idea if you do that. The great example in my mind, the president, any president, but President Trump, if he wanted to, is constitutionally allowed to pardon himself for anything and everything. Before he was in office, while he was in office, presidents such as Richard Nixon might have had a strong desire to do that for themselves at some point in American history. Presidents could just say, pardon everyone who's convicted of a crime under a law they don't like, and just sort of wave the pardon power around and use it however they like. But presidents don't do that, simply because we have norms of forbearance that you don't exercise all your constitutional authorities to their limit against your political opponents all the time, because, and this relates very directly to the court packing thing, because it is anticipated that you will not be in charge forever. Your party, your ideology is not going to run the country forever. So it is very realistic to think that if Democrats pack the court in 2021, the next time you have a Republican Congress and a Republican president, if the Democrats added 4, the Republicans will add 5. And I've been at the Supreme Court building. It's beautiful. It's not as big as the U.S. Capitol. I don't know if it has 30, 40, or 50 chairs, and they might have to do some renovations. But you get into this cycle of retaliatory court packing, which I think is very likely. You remember, the reason that Democrats don't have the ability to filibuster a nomination that President Trump might make now is because there used to be the ability to filibuster Supreme Court nominees. It was taken away in 2017. By Mitch McConnell and the Republican leadership in the Senate, in partial retaliation for Democrats taking away the filibuster on lower federal court nominees in 2013, the last time Democrats held the Senate. So if you start playing these games of, well, here's how we're going to retaliate, you invite that same retaliation back on yourself the next time around. And you have a cycle that I think, if you worry about the legitimacy of the court, is pretty problematic, right? And so when we talk about legitimacy, this is something political scientists spend a lot of time furrowing our brows over. But when we think of legitimacy, we think, as Professor Daum so nicely said, of the fact that the Supreme Court doesn't have any real power other than what we, the American citizens, are willing to extend it. I sometimes tell my students, and Cole might remember this from judicial politics, that the Supreme Court is kind of like Tinkerbell, right? Where, if you remember in the wonderful stage play Peter Pan, when Tinkerbell dies, that if you believe in fairies, clap your hands. And if everyone claps their hands, then Tinkerbell rises and can make people fly again. And in the same way, if all American citizens, if the other branches of government decided that they didn't want to pay attention to a Supreme Court ruling, other than the words of the ruling itself and our general belief that the rule of law has value in this country, there's nothing the court can actually do to enforce its rulings. And people like John Roberts are very cognizant of this fact, that they're the weakest and least dangerous branch, right? Congress has the power of taxing and spending, an incredibly important power. The president and the executive branch enforce the law, command the military. So there's real hard power in the other two branches of government. Not so with the Supreme Court. So as Professor Daum so nicely put it, in this world where the court is going to be out of balance with election returns in a sort of a 40 or 50-year cycle, if that court started consistently making deeply unpopular decisions over and over again that seem to consistently favor one political party, one political ideology over another, could that in theory start folks thinking, well, this institution, why should we do what it says? Why should we listen to it? Why should it have this authority in our lives? And then things like, well, if it's just going to be like a branch of the legislature favoring one political cause over another, then let's treat it like one. And if we have the power to add seats to it, then let's go right on ahead. But I actually want to sort of conclude this discussion on court packing with another, I think, element of this conversation that often goes, I think, underappreciated, right? So the notion is, well, the Supreme Court must have this incredible authority. They must be the final arbiter of questions of immigration, civil rights, abortion rights, gun control, on and on and on and on. And what is quite interesting, Professor Daum alluded to this very nicely, we essentially, in American politics, we have ceded an enormous amount of governing authority to the courts. And this has happened in large part because Congress has been in a long, slow cycle of decline and failing to assert its institutional prerogatives to pass legislation and govern, right? So it does, I think this moment raises some questions about, well, why is it the case that the way we're dealing with the children of undocumented people who've come to this country, why are we resolving that through an executive order of the president and then a court fight? Where's Congress? Right? Where are the representatives who have so much closer connection to their local communities in this process? They're cut out of governing, and we've let the executive branch and the unelected federal judiciary do a lot of the work of governing for us. And as Professor Daum said, it's the work of Congress to fix problems in laws, right? The Voting Rights Act. The Affordable Care Act has come before the Supreme Court a bunch, and oftentimes for very silly reasons. The case of King v. Burwell is very instructive, right? In this multi-thousand-page piece of legislation, there's one paragraph somewhere that makes it seem like the whole thing needs to fall apart instantly. It's clear that the drafters of this very complicated piece of legislation didn't intend that. Normally, Congress could just, we'll pass a quick little statute, we'll fix that right up, no big deal, no need to make a federal case out of it, literally. But because Congress increasingly is polarized along party lines, there's a lot of inability to overcome gridlock for members of Congress to take tough bipartisan votes that might come under some criticism from their own party. We're not seeing Congress doing that work of governing. So we're in this situation where every Supreme Court seat feels this monumental because we're in a situation where Congress is doing less and less and the other branches are doing more and more of the stuff that Congress used to do.
Well, thank you very much.
And so that often raises the question in people's mind, why? Yeah, so, okay, yeah, I'm good.
No, that was wonderful. I'm sorry to cut you off. If you had something you wanted to finish with, please go ahead.
So I guess the final point on that, and I'll turn it back over, is the reason, and it's complicated from a political science point of view, but people who are most engaged in politics, the people who vote for Congress, people who keep sending a lot of the same folks back over and over again, voters say they love compromise, they say they love bipartisanship, but they never reward it. ever awarded at the polls. So we get the government we vote for. And if you're not voting, you get the government other people vote for, which will be something that we'll come to at the end of this webinar here. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. We have a few minutes left, and I wanted to turn it back to our panelists, and I'll start with Professor Daum and just ask you, is there any final comments that you would like to make that you didn't get to make earlier and that you think is really important for these participants to hear?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to be said, and I see some of the questions that are coming up, and people should feel free to email me, and I would be happy to answer other questions directly if they're relevant to my comments. But I think, you know, one of the things that we need to remember, I'm just looking at Kaylee's comment about RBG on Native American rights, which is a very lengthy answer that I can't get to right now. But I think, you know, one of the things that we need to remember, and I think this follows on Professor Hitt's comments, is, you know, the Supreme Court justices are people, and they are not always consistent. They are not always the model individuals that we hold them up to be. They make bad decisions. That they would admit are bad decisions. We know once justices retire and we have access to their records and their papers after a certain period of time, we often see them ruminating about things they wish they had done differently. And I think, you know, it's really important as we honor Justice Ginsburg's legacy to recognize that, you know, there are aspects of it that, you know, may not be commensurate with, you know, all the celebration that we're having right now, right? That people cannot be all things to all people. And I think, you know, Professor Ginsburg and Justice Ginsburg, you know, did a great service to advancing equal rights of men and women in the United States. But I certainly think we could talk about, you know, some controversial decisions that were made in positions, but that's true of all the justices. And I think, you know, what I would just hope as we move forward in this moment where it just all seems so political, to remember that, you know, we have really mythologized the US Supreme Court and the justices, to Professor Hitt's point, and I would say a problem in ways that are problematic, because we look to them to solve so many problems, and that was not like legislative problems, sociocultural issues, you know, what one scholar calls like the problems of moral urgency, and that was not how the constitutional framers anticipated the US Supreme Court to be, you know, the referee in the culture wars of the 21st century. And so I think we really need to remember and be, you know, savvy common law scholars and think critically about people's legacies and celebrate people, but also recognize that it's more complicated than it at first seems. And I think we're in a moment right now where in this event is designed to really celebrate the legacy of Justice Ginsburg, but there's certainly a lot of work to be done to evaluate her legacy in the decades and, you know, and years ahead. And so we should always be thoughtful about that as well.
Thank you so much. And Professor Hitt, do you have some final comments?
Yeah, so I would echo everything Professor Daum said. I hammer home to my students in various classes that judges are people, right? We should, you know, smart people who are often very civic-minded, have, you know, high ideals, devote their lives to public service, but they're people. And we should be unsurprised that when we set up a process where political actors, so the president and the Senate, do the appointing and confirming of all our judges, that there would be a political dimension to what those judges do. That's sort of, it's baked in constitutionally. And so it's boring, a political science professor advice, but if you care about this stuff, if you're here on this webinar and you're fired up about one of the cases that President McConnell, or the issues President McConnell brought up, that Professor Daum brought up, whatever it might be, if you're fired up about this in any direction, you've got a great opportunity in just a few weeks to show up and vote. That is the fundamental act of citizenship. I often tell my students, if you wouldn't let your great uncle Herb pick their Spotify playlist for a cross-country road trip, why would you let him pick how your country's run? This is your chance. And obviously there's other things you can do. Calling your members of Congress, identifying yourself nicely as a constituent and stating what you'd like them to do helped, writing letters to the editor, lots of things, but getting involved, engaging, with the process. The only way that democratic representation happens. And if you don't want to do it, someone else is happy to do it for you. And they probably don't think the same way you do.
Thank you very much. One of the things I wanted to reflect on that both of you talked about is the public perception and confidence in the court. And you're absolutely right about Chief Justice Roberts. He's, by virtue of being Chief Justice, he is the justice that's assigned to the Fourth Circuit. And the Fourth Circuit often had its annual meetings in West Virginia, and I'm a member of the Fourth Circuit. So Chief Justice Roberts would come every year to speak. And one of the things that was really interesting about him is the more years he spoke, the more often his presentation was about the public confidence in the court and the perceived integrity of the court. And he was really struggling with a lot of what you're talking about, a sense of the abdication of Congress for doing what Congress really ought to be doing, but because of political paralysis could not. And so it was fascinating as time went on to watch how concerned he got about the role of the court. And I think that we are at this moment in time in our country where we're questioning the role of the court. And that today in the New York Times, I'm sure people heard this in podcasts and news all day long, but it appeared that in a response from President Trump to a reporter that he was not willing to say that he would be a participant in the clean and nonviolent and peaceful transition of power that we normally expect. And I think that gets back, Professor Hitt, to something you were saying about forbearance, that there have been these norms for so long. And I think the reason that this has caused such an uproar for so many people is because it goes to such a fundamental principle of democracy. And that sense of forbearance is something that we've come to expect, no matter what our political party is. And so I want to close on that note that the way in which we're looking now at the court, at Congress, at the executive branch, at the president, really is this amazing moment in time where it's driving all of us to go back to our original political science classes and separation of powers, and really ask, what is our democracy and how are these so incredibly important to who we are, to our identity as a nation, and how we function and move on in a way that celebrates our democracy and seeks justice. And I'd like to conclude on that remark, because I think that leads us very nicely where we're going to go next, which is to talk about voting and how fundamentally important the right to vote is, and how fundamentally important it is that we all vote. So Sam, would you like to take it away?
Yeah, thank you so much, President McConnell. A fantastic conversation, and thank you to all of our participants. My name is Sam Houghteling, and I'm with the John Straayer Center for Public Service Leadership, which was founded in 2017. Our mission on campus is to equip student leaders with the education, skills, and experience to be successful public servants. We also oversee a number of internship programs with local, state, and federal government partners. At CSU, we recognize that democratic systems require participation, and we also believe that our students are both current and future civic leaders, as well as the fact that the state of Colorado and country are well served when students from across the political spectrum choose to engage, listen, and participate in our democracy. Today, I'm specifically here to talk to you about 3 events that we have coming up over the next few weeks, 3 CSU voter engagement and county clerk forums, which are taking place via Zoom and will allow for our students and community at CSU to hear from and engage directly with our county clerk's office, Angela Myers, around important election issues, And our county clerks in Colorado really have a long history and record of transparent and innovative systems in election management. So we've been very well served here in Larimer County. So please come to these 3 events. They are taking place. The first forum is Monday, September 28th from noon to 1 p.m. The second is Wednesday, October 14th from 9 to 10. And the third is Wednesday, October 28th from 4 to 5 p.m. So basically, you don't need to come to all 3, but if you can come to one, that would be a fantastic sort of baseline for you to get information about the election. Please go to poli-sci.colostate.edu/news-events. So poli-sci.colostate.edu, that's where the event and Zoom location is if you want the information about how to get to the Zoom. And we have a fantastic list of campus partners that have been working on these events together, along with the county clerk's office. This includes the Division of Student Affairs, SLICE, Housing and Dining Services, ASCSU, the Department of Political Science, and the Straayer Center for Public Service Leadership. So thank you all. If you have any other questions about voting, please reach out to us. SLICE has also a fantastic resource that they've put on their website for students from all colleges and majors. This is important. We want to see CSU as a university that's at the very top in terms of voter engagement and voting. This is something that's very possible that we can do together, and our democracy will be better for it. So thank you all for the time today and the conversation. I really appreciate it.
With that, I want to say a final thank you to President McConnell, Dr. Daum, Dr. Hitt, Sam, thank you. Thank you to Jen Hitt for organizing this event, the Department of Political Science, the College of Liberal Arts. We're proud to be a CSU RAM, and this is just one of those examples. This was recorded this evening, so you can find a recording of this on the Department of Political Science YouTube channel. And yeah, take care and go Rams.
Thanks, Cole. Thank you, everybody. Have a good night.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Thanks all.
Dr. Daum and Dr. Hitt and Sam. And thank you, Cole, for pulling this all together. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Oh.